Great job on making it through this section. This is the part where we do a quick code review and a review of the code that we've been working on in the earlier lessons. So occasionally what happens with brackets is it will drop their live preview, and if you, in order to open that up, you have to click that live preview button again, or you can go into brackets live preview, as we do need to be running on an HTTP protocol. And brackets does provide that option to run it, or you could run it within a local machine or on any other web server where you've got a domain listed. So you got to make sure, in order to interact with the cookies, that you are running within the HTTP protocol, and make sure that you're not running in the file protocol, as your cookies won't work. So going into the code, and of course the JavaScript will still work in the file protocol because this is all browser based. So going into the console, let's clean up that. That's an error that's thrown when it checks to see that there's no icon there. So that's not having to do with our code at all. So we set up a little bit of styling to make our interface look nice. Set up some HTML, so we've got some inputs there in order to manipulate, get our cookies, set our cookies, added in some buttons for interaction. So those are the 4 actions that we want to take, where we do set cookie, get cookie, delete cookie, and list out all the cookies. Created an element in order to output the content. Then went into JavaScript and selected all the elements as objects in JavaScript. So either using query selector if we only had the one element that we're trying to select, or query selector all if there was more than one element that we're trying to select, and creating a node list. So that gave us the ability to loop through that node list, and we could add event listeners to each one of the buttons, and then using button action in order to handle the retrieval of what the intended button was and what action the user is trying to take. Also added in a default way to update that input, the date input, so it's not just blank and it's automatically set to 1 week ahead or 7 days ahead. So we used the JavaScript date object and added 7, so 7 days to the get date, which was the day of the week. Also, we had to do a quick fix for the day where we made sure that in case the day was coming back as a single digit, we are adding a 0, and that's where we're using the JavaScript method slice -2. So that always ensures that if the next week is 2 characters, we're going to return back those 2 characters, but if it's 1, it's going to add it to the 0, and then we're going to return back both the 0 and the character. Did the same thing for the month. And with get month, we start at 0, so we want it actually to start with the month of 1, so that's why we needed to add the 1. And the idea here was the same thing for the slice, so that we don't end up with a single character. The get full year gives us the 4 digits, so that was ideal. And once we had that and we built that, we could set the value using year, month, day, and dashes, and that would automatically update that input date to the current date plus 7 days. Then the next part of the code, and the most important part, of course, was the button interactions. So this is where we selected that element that had triggered the event. So we've got the source element. So that's a JavaScript method that you can use in order to get the source element as well that triggered the event. You could also use this object. So we got the inner text of it. And we also only want to get the inner text up to the first space. So we've got set cookie, get cookie, delete cookie. So there's no need to get the rest of the HTML, the inner text that's contained within that button. So that's why we're breaking it by the spacing. You don't have to do that. You could look for the button clicks, or you don't have to list these out for the user. So this is depending on what your preference is. So we were breaking that, and this also gave us a nice option to experiment a little bit more with some more different JavaScript methods. And of course, that's the objective of this course and this section, is to practice more about JavaScript. Next, we created a default blank object, and this is where all of the input values could go. And as we loop through the inputs, we get the name, we get the value. If the value is going to be the cookie expire, so if it's this input, then we need to treat this separately because this is a date object. So we want to make sure that we get it as a date value. So value as date is the way to retrieve that information. And once we have the temp name and the temp value, then we add it in as an object. We're outputting that object that we're submitting into the console, so we don't need those anymore. And then next, what we did here is we've got the temp value of the content that's contained within the button that was triggered the event. So we're checking to see if it's set, get, delete, or all. and depending on what it is, we launch the corresponding function, and we pass in the object values that are needed. So for most of them, it was just cookie name that was needed to get, delete, just needed cookie name. Set cookie needed a few other things where it needed the name, it needed the value, and the cookie expire value. So that was what those values from that object that we needed in order to set a cookie. So if we're setting a cookie, we're passing in some parameters. So of course, name, value, and expiry. And if the value is larger than 0, and we should also check maybe the name is larger than 0. That's another thing that can be added in to update and extend on this. So all we did is get the document.cookie object and set a name. And this parameter, it does need to be set within this type of format, within the string format. So it is expecting a name, and that's going to equal to, and this is where you need to make sure that you use the encode URI component. So that gets rid of the spacing and adds that %20 for spacing and so on. So it encodes it properly. And then of course, this is a string that's being set within the cookie. So we've got a path, we've got expires, and then the expires as well, we're using toUtc string, which is a JavaScript method that converts the date object into a UTC string value. And then we were adding into the output what happened, so the user knows what happened. And if we didn't add the cookie, then also a message back to the user so they know what happened. And then we created the functions that we had. We've got the get cookie. So this one was where we came in and we got the document.cookie object. We split it by the colon, so that means that each cookie is separated by the semicolon. So if we split that, then that gives us access to all the cookies. Then we loop through the cookies. We trim them because, as we saw, there's sometimes spacing that's added in. So make sure that you do trim those. Then we split them by the equal sign. So that gave us the cookie name and the value. So just as we were setting the name and the value, if we split it by the equal sign, then we can get the name and the value. So we're checking to see if the cookie name is the one that we've passed in, and if it is, then we output that it was found. But if it's not, then we didn't find it, and we just get the message, no cookies found. Can remove out the console message, and that decode URI component, super important because that decodes it back into a regular string format. We had erase cookies. So erase cookies, all it required was the name, and then the same as when setting a cookie, but we don't need all of this information because of course we're just removing it. So if it's already expired, then the cookie is going to get erased. And that's the idea here. As long as you're getting a date that's prior to the current date, it's going to remove that cookie automatically from the browser. And then we were setting output for the user so the user knows what happened. And the listing of the cookies, this was very similar to the get cookies, where we went through and we got the cookie object, split it by the semicolon, and then created some output content, so clearing that in case we press the button multiple times, so it doesn't keep adding as we are creating some elements on the fly in this function. Looping through all of the cookie objects, doing the same thing where we're trimming and then splitting that temp cookie value. So making sure that the temp cookie value has a length greater than 0. And if it does, that's where we can create the cookie, create the element dynamically using JavaScript. So this is what all we were doing is creating it. And of course, we did some additional stuff here that isn't really necessary for the functionality. We added a class of cookie and we added the same content to the output. So that's going to be showing up the same way. But if you want to be more specific on the content that's output in the cookie, you can do that as well by setting classes. Also adding event listener. So this is another option where when you click the cookie as it gets listed out, we run the function of erase cookie. And this was more to demonstrate that we can reuse the functionality in JavaScript. So reuse it in multiple ways, as we saw here when we've got the event listener. So again, this one is not essential, but it was just demonstrating more JavaScript functionality that you could add in. Then lastly, we're setting the text content. So letting the user know what cookie it is and the value of the cookie. And then we are appending that to the output element. So that's the element with the class of output that we selected way in the beginning, where we're outputting that inner content to. So basically that gave us the ability to build out a list of all of the cookies. And as you can see in this application, as it's functioning, we get a listing of all of the cookies. If we set more cookies and we list out all of the cookies, you're going to get all of those cookies being set there. And we can reset, we can change the value. So all that does is that override overwrites the value. So you can see now is the name, and that's the value associated with it. And especially when you have spacing and you set the spacing, when you encode and decode, and actually I just clicked that so it got removed. So let's set that again, and all cookies. So remember, whenever you're clicking these, that they are being removed because we did add in that function. So I hope you had an opportunity to try the code out for yourself, and if not, the source code has been included, as well as if you've got any questions, comments, want clarity on any of the content covered within the earlier lessons, please feel free to connect with me. I'm always happy to help answer, clarify content, and add additional content into the course. Thanks again for taking this section and learning more about JavaScript and setting cookies.